Hello everyone, I'm Alex Dykes, and today we're out here taking a look at the all-new 2014 Buick Regal GS. Stay tuned for a separate video on the Buick Regal E-Assist, which is the mild hybrid version of this same car. Now, Buick has slowly becoming the American branch of Opel, and this is an Opel insignia with Buick logos on it, which has been a very good thing for the Buick brand. Speaking of that Buick brand though, the Regal is in an interesting position because it is the middle child of GM's lineup. It's right in there in between Cadillac and Chevy, and the Regal is the mid-sized car in between the Verano and the LaCrosse. Being a middle child for Buick is a little bit tricky because this needs to not step on the toes of the Verano or the LaCrosse, while at the same time not stepping on the toes of anything from Chevy or from Cadillac. That means that this tops out at about $45,000, starts at around $30,000, which is right there in between Chevy and Cadillac. But it also means that you won't find Cadillac-style features like real wood trim or upscale leather or anything like that going on the inside. And you won't find a rear-wheel drive Buick. This is a front-wheel drive Opel insignia with Buick logos on it, as I said. Now, completely new might be a little bit disingenuous. In truth, the 2014 Regal is more of a retooling rather than a redesign. We have a completely new front end here with a completely new bumper, completely new, slightly more exaggerated Buick grille with this very large Buick logo. This Buick logo is this big because we have the optional radar cruise control in this model. That's where the radar cruise control sensor is located, right behind there. We also get front parking sensors up front. We don't get any fog lights in the Regal GS this year, and we get restyled headlamps that are a little bit more aggressive than before. One change that I'm delighted to see is these Ventaports that have shrunk for this year, and now they're finally the appropriate number. For a while there, Buick was doing 6 Ventaports even on cars that had 4-cylinder engines, and now we have 4 Ventaports, 2 on this side, 2 on the other, because this is a 4-cylinder only Buick model. These are not functional vents at all, they're really just decorative, and they're attached to the hood. One thing that I'd also like to note is that they're a little bit smaller than the vents on something like the Enclave or the Encore. The Enclave and Encore's vents are huge, and you can see them from the inside of the vehicle, something that I found very distracting, but the Regals are fairly attractive in this particular size on the hood. Side styling for most Buicks is plain Jane, and that continues in the Buick Regal, although it is just about as exciting as most other entries in this segment. That leads us to the competition. The Buick Regal GS competes really with something like a Volvo S60, a Lincoln MKZ, Lexus ES350, something along those lines. It really doesn't compete with the rear-wheel drive competitors from Japan or from Germany, or even from General Motors' own stable, the Cadillac ATS or CTS. One thing to keep in mind when you take a look at that competition, along with the Acura TL, is that the Regal GS is fairly large and it's also fairly long. It is decently longer than a Cadillac ATS or a Cadillac CTS or a BMW 5 Series or a BMW 3 Series. Much of the length difference between this and something like a rear-wheel drive competitor goes right here to the rear seat. And that's really what the Lexus ES has been for in the Lexus lineup. It's been for that person that wants a luxury brand name but wants extra rear seat room. That's really going on here in the Buick Regal as well, because if you compare this to, again, the Cadillac lineup, then you get an awful lot more rear seat room. One good thing to keep in mind also is that compared to the Volvo lineup, you get a decent amount more rear seat room as well, because the S60 and the S80 have about 4 inches less room back there than the Regal GS, or than most of the other competitors in this front-wheel drive luxury segment. The design of the Buick Regal is very Opel, and I think that's actually a good thing because I've always found Opel's designs to be attractive, but the real hallmark of that is this chrome strip that runs across the back of the trunk lid and then of course has the room for the Buick or the Opel logo. Really unchanged for America versus the European version of this vehicle, makes it look fairly distinctive out here on the American roadway. Down here we have hidden exhaust tips. We also have standard rear parking assist in the Regal GS. Overall, it's very attractive, and one nice touch is they hide the trunk lid button right there under the Buick logo, which is very handy. Now, all Buicks have this very sloping trunk lid, but GS models add an additional spoiler top right here. The GS trim buys you these very attractive 19-inch wheels wrapped in 245 40R19 rubber, as well as these Brembo brakes. These are not the largest Brembo brakes on earth, but this car is only 3,600 pounds. That's a very important number to keep in mind, and it's one that I'm going to continue to stress throughout this video because it is fairly light for a vehicle this size, but it's also fairly light when you compare it to the rear-wheel drive competitors that the Buick Regal sort of competes with, because the Buick Regal's almost the same price as certain Cadillac models, and actually a little bit more expensive in this GS trim than certain base trims of the CTS or the ATS, but it is a decent amount lighter. When you say Buick Regal GS, to me the one that I remember is from the 90s, and it had a 3.8-liter supercharged V6 engine in it. It only produced about 240 horsepower or so. But the modern Regal is a 4-cylinder only engine lineup, and the Regal GS no longer gets any more power than the regular Buick Regal. So the regular Buick Regal and the GS both get a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine. It's very closely related to the one that's in the Cadillac ATS and the Cadillac CTS. It produces 259 horsepower and 295 pound-feet of torque. The only difference in the GS is that that engine produces that same 295 pound-feet of torque about 500 RPM sooner than the regular Buick Regal. It really doesn't provide that much of a difference out on the road, however. That is a 39 horsepower increase for the regular Buick Regal over last year's regular model, but it is a slight drop from the 270 horsepower that the Regal GS was getting last year. There's also a no-cost mild hybrid option. That is a 2.4-liter four-cylinder engine, produces 182 horsepower and 172 pound-feet of torque. They're dubbing that E-Assist, and it also includes a lithium-ion battery and a belt alternator starter system that can provide a few horsepower of additional boost for that engine. It is a no-cost option, so you just choose whether you want the 2-liter turbo or that E-Assist system, but that's only in the regular Buick Regal, not in the GS, of course. All-wheel drive is available as an option in both the 2-liter turbo regular Buick Regal or this Buick Regal GS, but it is not available with that E-Assist system. Power sent to the wheels for most models via a 6-speed General Motors automatic transaxle or an optional 6-speed manual transaxle, but that's only available in the front-wheel drive version of the GS. Driver's seat comfort is very good in this segment, and probably second only to something like a Volvo S60, whose seats are very comfortable. We do have 4-way adjustable power lumbar support, which you don't get in that Volvo model. Is one thing to keep in mind. 2-position memory seat, multi-way power adjustable driver's seat with a manual tilt telescoping steering wheel with a decent range of motion. The standard seats in the GS have these fairly aggressive seat bottom as well as seat back bolsters on them, really help keep you in the seat. For my average 6-foot frame, this fits me like a glove, but if you're a larger driver, you may want to spend some time in a GS to make sure that you fit comfortably in these seats. Out back, we have a decent amount of legroom in the Regal. This front seat's adjusted for me, and I have about 4 inches of legroom left there or so. That's one definite reason for buying a Regal over one of those rear-wheel drive competitors like a Lexus IS or a BMW 3 Series or even Cadillac ATS, is because you get a decent amount more rear legroom in a vehicle like this. The vehicle is a little bit larger than those other cars, and all of that comes right here to the rear seat legroom. We also get a little bit more legroom than something like a Volvo S60 or a Volvo S80, about 3 inches or so, but it's about the same as an Acura TL or a Lincoln MKZ. One thing the Regal doesn't have a whole lot of, however, is rear seat headroom. If I try and lean back in this seat, I can't actually, because my head needs to be cocked to one side in order to actually have my head hit the headrest in this vehicle. That's because of the swoopy coupe-like profile going on back here. This is not a problem in the Acura TL or in the Volvo models because they do have a less coupe-like profile on the outside. It does mean that the Regal GS looks a little bit sexier from the side, but it also means that adults will have a little bit of a hard time fitting in the rear, which is a little bit odd because we do have all this legroom back here, but we don't really have as much headroom as I would like. Now keep in mind, we are in the Regal GS, which does have the standard sunroof, so that is something to keep in mind. If I move over to the far side of the GS, this front seat was adjusted for a 6'5" passenger. I still have a decent amount of legroom left behind this seat, but again, I still have that same headroom problem. You can probably see it better from this angle, but if I were to actually sit upright with my butt in the back of the seat and my back on the backrest of the car, my head has to cock to one side in order to fit in this ceiling. Middle seat is actually fairly comfortable, all things considered, and it is not a whole lot higher than these 2 outboard seats, which means you could fit an adult back here for a short trip out. We do have 2 air vents in the back as well as a 120-volt power outlet right here as well. The rear seats fold almost completely flat with the cargo area, allowing you to more easily push bags straight through from the cargo area into the back of the car. They do unlatch on the inside of the car, which is something that I prefer, not in the trunk. When it comes to the cargo area, the Regal scores 7 out of 10 points in our exclusive Trunk Comfort Index. We do lose a few points for these hinges, which do impact the cargo area, as well as furnishings in here that are not quite as nice as some of the German and Swedish competition. We do gain points, however, for a handle right here in the trunk lid, which makes it an awful lot easier to get in or out of the trunk. Let's take our usual spin around the interior. We have height adjustable seat belts over there on the passenger side as well as on the driver's side. Over here we have a 2-way adjustable manual headrest. We have these very attractive leather stitched seats, and you can see from this angle the kind of bolstering that we have going on there on the side, on the bottom cushion as well as the side cushion. One thing to keep in mind when looking at cars like this, and that's any manufacturer, is that you are going to get increased wear on these aggressive bolsters. So it is something to keep in mind, and just be careful when you buy a car to always try and plop your butt right in the seat rather than drag it across the bolster. Over here on the doors we have very attractive trim. It's difficult to see in our black on black model here. We do have soft touch plastics all around, just imitation carbon fiber over there. Moving over to the dashboard, we have a fairly decently sized glove box, as you can see right there. Soft touch dashboard uppers, hard plastics on the lower. Moving over to the dashboard middle here, we have our large 8-inch touchscreen. This is Buick's latest IntelliLink software. It's based on Cadillac Q. If you want to know more about that, then go ahead and click that link down below to be taken over to our infotainment review. Right up here we have our adaptive suspension buttons. This is GS mode, traction control off, hazard lights, lane departure warning, parking sensors, and this is sport mode. So these are the two different suspension modes in the Regal GS, which has the adaptive suspension system. Down here we have our physical buttons for our radio, single slot CD player right there, touch buttons for both the heated seats as well as the climate control. This is a dual zone system over there, driver and passenger. Physical buttons right here. There's been a definite physical button reduction in this generation of the Buick Regal versus the last generation, which did have sort of an Acura level of buttons right there in the dashboard. Moving out to the shifter, we have a little cubby right behind it with a 12-volt power outlet there. Shifter with a manual mode over here on this side. Electric parking brake, little cubby right there for whatever it is you want to store. And then we have two medium-sized cup holders with a sliding lid. Because of the European origins of this Opel Insignia and Buick Regal, these cup holders aren't quite as big as I would like. They definitely have a little bit of trouble holding two large American-sized sodas there. If we open this armrest, we have a fairly decently sized cubby right there, and then in a separate little compartment right here, we have our two USB inputs for this system, as well as an additional 12-volt power port. We're in the Regal GS, so we have this standard LCD instrument cluster right here. If you were in the regular Regal, then you would instead get a small 4-inch LCD right down here below the speedometer that would display a similar amount of information. Here we have our tachometer, we have our oil temperature over here. On this other side, we have electrical system voltage, we have our engine coolant temperature, and then our fuel gauge right there. The system is very configurable, but not quite as configurable as Chrysler's 7-inch LCD gauge cluster. Right now we're in sport mode, and we're going to change to GS mode so you can see the difference. It basically just flashes there and adds a little bit of a green highlight around things. If we turn GS mode off and we go back to regular drive mode, then the display changes to a slightly more modern display look. The display can also be configured by the button arrangement on the steering wheel. We have access to our info screens. This is where you'll find your trip computer, fuel range, oil life, tire pressure, things along those lines. Then we have a GS performance screen. This gives us our G meter, which is a little bit silly in something like this. We get, for some reason, duplicate gauges as well. We get two different oil temperature gauges there. And then if we scroll down, we get an oil pressure gauge, and then we move on to two electrical system voltage gauges right there. I'm not sure why those are duplicated in this system. Moving back to this, we have an audio screen, and one difference between this and something like Chrysler's Uconnect system is that when we're on our iPod or USB device, it will actually display track information there, and you can use this system to browse that device as well, which is something that you can't do on the Chrysler system. Over here we have a fairly full-featured phone interface with this system. We do have access to recent calls, contacts, etc. to dial right from this setup. In the nav screen, you get nav information as well as a mini map. So right here, it's still loading on this display, but you can actually see that it actually displays a small map right there inside that instrument cluster, which I find very handy. Moving down, we have our settings page, and this is where you can change system options, convert from US to metric. You can link the display mode to your drive mode, which is something this car has on right now, and you can enable or disable certain pages in the system so you don't have to do so much scrolling. Moving out to the steering wheel, this is a very soft leather-wrapped steering wheel. It has a slight flat bottom right there and these sport grips up top. I think this is actually more attractive than a decent number of GM's other steering wheels, including the modern Cadillac steering wheel design, and it's really just down to these button modules. So over here on this side of the steering wheel, this button module controls that 7-inch LCD instrument cluster there. We have our track up and down buttons, volume up and down buttons, and select. This is an awful lot easier to use than the little toggle going on in the Cadillac models. We don't have a leather-wrapped airbag cover, so that is something that you do get in the Cadillac models, but we don't get in the Buicks. Moving over here to this other side, we have our heated steering wheel button, cruise control on-off button, cancel. This sets the distance of the cruise control system if you have radar cruise control, or the pre-collision warning system if you have just the regular pre-collision warning system. You can see it displays it right there in the instrument cluster. Voice command button, hang-up button for the telephone, and then speed up and down and resume for the cruise control. Well, this video is focusing primarily on the Regal GS. The important thing to know out on the road is that there isn't a great deal of daylight between the regular Regal and the Regal GS. The GS does get the adaptive suspension system, and we of course do get a few extra goodies on the car like Brembo brakes and this 8-inch LCD instrument cluster. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of difference between the two. So the performance numbers are pretty much the same, 0 to 60 in 6.7 seconds. And in terms of road quietness, we score 68.5 decibels out on the road. The Regal GS, of course, does have this MagneRide adaptive suspension system, which is also used in a number of Cadillac products. And we do have 3 modes. We have normal, we have sport, and we have GS. Normal is a fairly firm European style ride, and that's because GM did very little to convert the Opel Insignia into the Buick Regal. Instead of detuning the suspension and making it softer like they did with the last generation of Regal, they've left that European suspension intact, so it's fairly firm for an American car and definitely one of the firmest Buicks ever created. Sport is firmer and GS is yet firmer. The system does a very good job of soaking up large bumps on the road, leaving you to feel the smaller road imperfections, which is usually what people prefer in terms of sport suspension designs. The all-wheel drive system in the Regal GS helps it feel very confident. The only real difference between the all-wheel drive system in the Regal GS and the regular Regal is the inclusion of a limited slip differential in the back of the Regal GS. Honestly, it's not doing that much for you because really only about 50% of the power is being sent to the rear, and you really don't need a limited slip differential in the rear for a car that's getting 50% of the power to both axles. So in normal daily driving, there's no difference whatsoever. In snow driving, there could be a little bit of a difference because you would get better grip out there in the back. And in really hard driving out on the track, there's just a very small amount of difference, probably not enough to really worry about, honestly. The 2-liter turbo under the hood is a definite improvement over the last 2-liter turbo that Buick used. It's definitely more refined, although you still hear a decent amount of engine noise inside the cabin, and that engine noise isn't as refined as the German competition. The big benefit from this engine, however, is fuel economy, because we've been averaging 22.5 to 23 miles per gallon in very mixed driving in this all-wheel drive Regal GS, which is just about what you should expect according to the EPA. And that's a definite improvement over the last generation of Regal. You can get about 30 to 31 miles per gallon if you choose the front-wheel drive version of the Regal GS, 31 miles per gallon if you get that 6-speed manual transmission, 30 miles per gallon with the automatic, and you take about a 4 mile per gallon hit for the all-wheel drive system. If you do get that 2.4-liter e-assist system, we're told you can get 36 miles per gallon, but stay tuned for a separate video on the Buick Regal e-assist. Unless you're really pushing the limits of the Regal GS, this feels very confident out on the road. The steering is very precise, and on winding mountain roads like this, you can really tell that the Regal GS handles incredibly well. Even though the weight balance isn't as good as something like a Cadillac CTS or a BMW 5 Series, which are about the same size as this Regal GS, the GS handles incredibly well because it's just lighter overall. Same size tires, lighter overall, gives you better handling, even though the handling doesn't feel quite as good and in terms of overall feel as those rear-wheel drive competitors. The actual numbers are very good for the Regal GS. That's all the more important to know about the Regal GS because price-wise, the Regal GS is fairly close to a lot of rear-wheel drive competitors. So you just have to decide whether you're after the rear-wheel drive feel or not, because the Regal GS handles fairly well in most circumstances, gets slightly better fuel economy, is lighter and larger overall, but it doesn't have that rear-wheel drive feel. The light curb weight and those large Brembo brakes really help the Regal GS from experiencing any sort of brake fade out on these winding mountain roads that we're on right here. This is a slight improvement over the regular Regal. The regular Regal does have very good brakes, and because of its light curb weight and fairly sizable standard brakes, we didn't experience too much fade in that either, but this Regal GS is that little bit better. One thing to keep in mind, of course, is that the Regal GS does have these Brembo brakes, so it is going to be better than most standard brake packages of comparable $40,000 to $45,000 vehicles that you'll find out on the road, including those rear-wheel drive competitors like a BMW 3 Series or 5 Series or a Cadillac ATS or CTS, because those standard vehicles have regular standard brakes, but they're also heavier than this Regal GS, so more weight equals more potential for brake fade. Buick's sales proposition, like most other front-wheel drive near luxury vehicles, is all about value. Ranging from $30,615 to $45,475, you can get a Cadillac ATS 2.0T or even a base Cadillac CTS 2.0T for the same price as this Buick Regal GS. However, those models wouldn't have all the same features that you get in this Regal GS. You wouldn't have the radar cruise control, the pre-collision warning system, the blind spot monitoring system, front parking sensors, etc. However, you would get things like real wood trim and slightly better leather, along with a slightly more attractive interior, better quality parts on the inside. And that's again because Buick is trying their hardest not to step on the toes of Cadillac or Chevy, so you find a better quality interior in here than you would in something like a Chevy Impala, but it's not going to be quite as nice as you'd find in the Cadillac lineup. That is a little bit of a limiting factor for them because Lincoln and Volvo don't have that same sort of constraint, and so you do find real wood trim, slightly nicer interior parts in something like a Lincoln MKZ or a Volvo S80. Now the Lincoln MKZ is slightly more expensive than the Regal GS, and the Volvo S60 is about $5,000 more expensive for a similarly equipped vehicle, although you do get more power in that Volvo S60, as well as real wood trim and a number of other nicer features on the inside. Something like a Volvo S80 is a little bit more closely sized to this Regal GS because the S60 is a little bit smaller, but it's going to be about $10,000 more expensive than this Regal GS. Would I buy a Regal GS? No, I probably wouldn't, but I would recommend that anybody shopping in this segment test drives one because it is a great car to drive and it is a decent value. What would I buy instead of a Regal GS? I would probably buy a Cadillac ATS 2.0T. We had one a few months ago and that was a great vehicle. It handles impeccably, it has a great interior, and for the price of a Regal GS, you could get a nicely equipped Cadillac CTS 2.0T. Now you wouldn't get all-wheel drive for that price, and you wouldn't get all the same electronic features that you get in the Regal GS, but you would get more of a driver's vehicle. So it's really up to you whether you'd like the driver's vehicle or whether you'd like the rear seat legroom or all those electronic features in the vehicle. For me, I'd rather take the better handling vehicle, and the Cadillac CTS and Cadillac ATS are among the best in their class. I would buy those before I bought something like a BMW 3 Series or a BMW 5 Series, so that's really fairly high praise for something like a Regal GS, saying that all I'd buy instead of it is a rear-wheel drive Cadillac. Because this is a very competitive segment, I would definitely put the Volvo S60 T6 all-wheel drive also on your shopping list. It's considerably faster than this Regal GS. It handles a little bit better, but it doesn't feel quite as nice as the Regal GS out on the road because it is a decent amount heavier. It is also a little bit more expensive than the Regal GS, so the value proposition isn't quite there, but I think overall it is a better car and it might just be worth the $5,000 extra. But again, this is a very competitive segment and they're very close together. I would definitely buy this before I bought something like an Acura TL, which is a little long in the tooth, or the Lexus ES350, which is just not sporty at all. It is a little bit floaty, and also I find its interior a little bit cheap. If you're out there looking at the Lexus ES350, then I suggest you actually look at a Toyota Avalon because it's a nicer car on the inside. Versus something like a Lincoln MKZ, the MKZ is, I think, a little bit more edgy in terms of styling. It also offers a few more features on the inside that the Regal GS doesn't get, but it doesn't have the same feel out on the road as the GS. The GS just feels like a more complete, more solid driver's car package out on the road. Now the MKZ does have that hybrid model, which is, in theory, a better hybrid version than the e-assist system available in the Regal, so I'd probably put that a little bit higher than the e-assist version of the Regal. But again, stay tuned for an e-assist video coming in the next few months and we can get our hands on one. Be sure and click that subscribe banner at the bottom of your screen so you can be updated on all of our latest videos. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video, and if you have any particular questions, you can always insert those in the comment section down below, or you can always email me at alex@alexonautos.com.